have the opportunity to catch up. So we are recording now. I don't want you to be nervous about making a mistake on this, okay? The only way you're going to learn how to do this is by kind of taking a guess, taking a stab, and seeing where you kind of were either misguided or just missed the mark a little bit. It's not a knock on your intellect one way or the other. These are very difficult questions. So again, I'm going to ask you to kind of go through the documents here, and instead of me spoon feeding, I want to hear what you have to say about these documents, because if you can't understand the documents, I'm not going to be there on May 15th to help you out. So let's learn how to do that, and don't be afraid to kind of mess up here. There is no judgment here, okay? You're doing the best you can with what you got. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and present the screen here. And bring up the actual DBQ. So this is the DBQ you had from 1775 to 1830. Many African Americans gained freedom from slavery, yet during the same period, the institution of slavery expanded. Explain why both of those changes took place. Analyze the ways that both free African Americans and enslaved African Americans responded to the challenges confronting them. Okay, so this question is very, very multi-layered. What you need to understand from the question, and you always have to make sure you understand exactly what the question is asking in totality to make sure that your thesis is written correctly and that you are actually addressing the full question. They're saying, they're giving to you that freed slaves grew, that there was a large group of emancipated free men and women. At the same time, the institution that they were just freed from grew. So they're asking, how is that possible that you can have certain people being freed from their servitude, and then a vast majority of a growth, an almost exponential growth in the institution of slavery? So how is that possible that some are being freed, yet the slave population is growing? That's the first part. The next part of the question is they're saying, all right, analyze the ways that both free African Americans and enslaved African Americans responded to the challenges. So how did the free men and women respond to their newfound freedom, and how did those that were still enslaved respond to who they were at the time, their situation? You have to answer both questions if you're going to answer this DBQ. So this is a very tough DBQ, and I don't expect you to knock this out of the park. It's tough, okay? And if you get a question like this, it's going to be difficult on May 15th to make sure that you cover everything. So it's important that we go over this, all right? So let's make an agreement right now. Number one, you are going to participate. Now, if you do not feel comfortable saying something, the chat function is always up and running. So anytime I ask a question, I will check chat and allow you to unmute your microphone and participate, all right? So please feel free to participate in either way. The only time I'm ever going to call you out is if you're not participating. This is not a cue for somebody to just be like, well, I'm out and exit stage left. I won't call out wrong answers. I won't say, oh man, so-and-so, man, you were really off on this. No, I will say, all right, you know, that's I can see where you got that or whatever else. That's fine. There's no real right or wrong way to go about this, but there is a right way of approaching the documents. So let's make sure we're practicing that, okay? We've had 3 DBQ sessions where I've walked you through and kind of spoon-fed what these documents mean. Now it's your turn, okay? Otherwise, we're not getting anywhere and we're just spinning our tires. So let's make sure that we're participatory today. So if you have your document, if you filled out this document here, that's important to do, okay? If you have not filled this out, at least get out a sheet of paper or have this on split screen or something to where you are following along, okay? Now, and as always, before we turn to the documents, let's talk about major historical events. Now, this part's me. I don't expect you to do this part, okay? This part is me. So here we go. The 1770s. What happened in the 1770s? If you're really going to get technical here, you have to start with the American Revolution, Okay, that's the overarching what's happening at the time. All right. So in 1770, you have the Boston Massacre. Okay. 1773, you have the Boston Tea Party. Remember, 3 years apart on those two events. So it's not like Boston was a powder keg just waiting to explode within a couple of months. This took a long time for us to get to the point where the king's policies and the king's procedures were going too far for us. Okay. So Boston Massacre happens in 1770, in March of 1770. In December of 1773, the Boston Tea Party happens. Okay. Again, both in Boston. Now, are there other events happening throughout the colonies? Yes, but these are the overarching ones that, help you to at least frame the time frame. In 1775, we have Lexington and Concord. So we have the very first shots of the American Revolution in April of 1775, the shot heard around the world. Okay. First Continental Congress also meets that year to discuss what to do. What do we do in case major conflict does occur? Okay. And then when the Second Continental Congress meets, that's the group, and they meet that year as well. When the Second Continental Congress comes in, they meet specifically to say, all right, Lexington and Concord have happened. What do we do in response? And that's when they send the Olive Branch petition, trying to ask King George III to kind of, hey, let's just, before too much blood is on our hands, let's forgive and forget and move on. But they also hire up George Washington to lead the troops. They also say, you know what, we need a continental army. And so they put in charge a Virginian in charge of the militias and the Continental Army that is currently in Massachusetts. A big first step to trying to unify the colonies under a common cause, and at least a common name, if you will. Okay. Now, of course, what is the Second Continental Congress most known for? In July of 1776, they send off the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration of Independence is 1776, along with, if you remember, in August, right after we signed the Declaration of Independence, where these guys say we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, they're basically saying they're going to hang if they don't win this war. Right after they sign this document, they lose the Battle of New York, and lose it in pretty decisive manner. I mean, they lose on Long Island, they lose on the island of Manhattan. They just get absolutely stomped, and they barely make it out to New Jersey and are chased throughout New Jersey by Cornwallis and the British regulars. So this is not a good time to be in the Continental Army. It's not until Christmas of 1776 that the Battle of Trenton occurs, with a ensuing Battle of Princeton, where both the American forces surprise the Hessians at Trenton after Washington crosses the Delaware, and then also kind of outmaneuver the British and Princeton. Now, of course, they abandon that immediately and go into the hills trying to hide for the rest of the winter. But it sends a clear message to the British that the fighting spirit of the American soldier is not done yet. It's a stroke of genius on Washington's part. It's not until 1778 that we get the turning point. If you remember, the turning point of the American Revolution was the Battle of Saratoga, when gentleman Johnny Burgoyne comes down from Canada thinking that he can just stroll on into Albany and that the British forces can link somewhere in New York and cut the American colonies in half. When they do that, or at least when they attempt to do that, Burgoyne just stumbles into massive issues, and he ends up getting surrounded at Saratoga. He surrenders, and while that militarily is a big deal, it was even more of a big deal diplomatically, because that's what convinces the French government to support the war effort and to join in on our side. That's all 1770s. Now, does any of that really pertain to what they're talking about in the question? Not really, except you could glean out of the Declaration of Independence a couple of things. First of all, in the Declaration of Independence, we stated that all men are created equal. A very suspect phrase, especially when it's written by a slave owner in Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so obviously you can utilize that verbiage from the Declaration of Independence. You can also, if you remember, and I mentioned this in class, the very first draft Thomas Jefferson ever put in for the Declaration of Independence laid at the feet of King George III, amongst the many other charges they had against the king, whether it be going after trial, the refusal of trial by jury, or the refusal to have our own courts, our own legislative assemblies, the refusal of him to kind of allow us representation. All the charges that we put at the feet of King George III in the actual Declaration of Independence, in the original copy, Jefferson blamed him for slavery. Okay, so even Jefferson's wrestling with this really, he calls it a stinking institution. He's also, even though he is a proponent of it, he's somebody that practices slavery. He doesn't feel comfortable with it, nor does Washington for that matter. Okay, so, and keep in mind, Franklin, who's sitting in that same Continental Congress, is one of the first people to start an abolitionist society. So there is an undercurrent in our fight for independence of what does that really mean for everybody? Is it independence for only a few? Is it independence for everybody? So that's what you can keep in mind for the 1770s. 1780 through 1820, some events that you can kind of glean from that time period. Yorktown happens in 1781. So the Battle of Yorktown, big deal. We take Cornwallis, we surround him, the French fleet shows up, he has to surrender most of his army, and then it's only a matter of time for the British to basically sue for peace at that point. They probably could have continued, but for lack of better terminology, this was turning into kind of their Vietnam situation where our revolution was very unpopular back in England and people were losing faith in the British hierarchy to kind of prosecute this war. So Yorktown certainly kind of is the death knell of the British efforts to win that war, meaning 2 years later, the treaty is signed in Paris. Okay, so 2 years later, the American Revolution officially comes to an end with our independence. Now, if you remember, the 1780s turned very tumultuous after that because it's a question of, did we declare independence of an entire nation, or did we declare independence of 13 separate individual nations? So we come into this era under the Articles of Confederation where it's not exactly clear what we really accomplished. The crowning achievement, of course, is the Northwest Ordinance. By 1787, where not only did they declare a area of the United States that we had gotten from the British, namely Ohio, it's the Northwest Territory, namely Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan eventually become the 5 states that come out of it. So not only do we get that territory and we solidify it on how those territories could eventually become a state, so that's a crowning achievement of the Confederation's Congress that they got that done. But if you remember in the Northwest Ordinance, they declared slavery in this territory to be null and void. They couldn't have slavery. Okay, so that's the first time really that slavery is addressed directly by the American government. Okay, they failed to do so at the very beginning of the American Revolution, but they do address the issue in the Northwest Ordinance. Now, that's all well and good, but they've got other problems. And if you remember in 1786 and 87, Shays' Rebellion is happening up in Massachusetts when farmers in the western part of the state don't believe they're getting proper representation in their government, and they feel like their taxation is wrong. They rise up in rebellion against the Massachusetts government, and it takes a while for the Massachusetts government to get organized. And of course, they don't get any help from the national level because they don't have power to tax and they can't have a standing army. So it's just kind of a mess, which inspires at that point that they need a convention to fix the problems of the Articles. Now, of course, if you remember the story, they show up at the convention and realize there's no real way to fix it, mostly because Rhode Island doesn't show up. Okay, when you have one entire state not show up, if you remember under the Articles of Confederation, you needed all 13 to agree in order to change the Articles of Confederation. Without Rhode Island there, they can't amend the document. So they scrap it instead and illegally basically pull a bloodless coup. They overthrow the existing government. And they would argue that they're just kind of replacing it. But in a sense, what they did was another revolution. They changed governments and elected George Washington the first president. By doing so under the Constitution, it's ratified in 1788 and 89, and Washington becomes the first president of the United States. Now, of course, you can fast forward and talk about in 1800 that Thomas Jefferson becomes president in what was known as the Revolution of 1800, where they transitioned the government from being Federalist to Democratic Republican, the very first time that one political party had to hand off power to the other because of an election. They managed to do that without too much of an issue. In fact, there was no bloodletting. If you remember, the only blood that was shed in the early republic over the formation of the actual United States government was Alexander Hamilton. And that was because he and Burr had beef. That's the only blood that was spilt. There was no, massive war or anything like that. It was just Hamilton. Hamilton had to die for the republic to live, if you will. Okay. Now, of course, that all happens in the early 1800s under Thomas Jefferson's watch as president. He, of course, adds Louisiana in 1803. In 1807, he causes a stir with his embargo against the British and the French because they're at war. And, of course, this is the guy that criticized Washington for being neutral in the struggle earlier with the French and the British. Now here he's doing the same thing and then some by saying we're not even going to trade with people who are at war, which of course hurt New England. Him being from Virginia did not work out well in that regard. The slave trade officially ends in 1808, the international slave trade. In 1808, remember the deal in the Constitution, it was the only real deal except for the Three-Fifths Compromise, which again is something you can talk about in regards to this question. The other thing was that they said in 1808, 20 years after ratification of the Constitution, they would end the international slave trade, which begs the question again, according to the question, there were freed slaves, and yet slavery as an institution increased during this time period all the way up until the 1830s. So how is it possible that you can end the slave trade here, and yet you have an exponential growth? Now, some of that, of course, is illegal, slaves coming in, and you can certainly talk about that in regards to during Van Buren's presidency in the 1830s. You can talk about the Amistad situation, that is one of many slave ships that was illegally bringing slaves into the United States. So there certainly is a smuggling issue with that, but they also have a tremendous amount of, hey, we need more slaves, we need to breed more. So it becomes a almost industry, which by doing so makes what used to be, well, they're my slaves, they're part of my family, into more of, well, we need to breed as many possible. It becomes kind of like an institution, an industrial complex, if you will. Continuing the 18 teens, of course, you have the War of 1812 during that time period, and of course, you have the Missouri Compromise by 1820, which does address the issue of slavery right away. Now, the reason you need to remember that is part of this is also going to be, is there a regional difference? The Missouri Compromise proves that because they literally make a line between North and South, between free and slave, okay? In the 1830s, if you're transitioning over, in the 1830s, it's of course Jacksonian America. He gets elected in 1828. Jackson's certainly going to shift the government. He's a Southern slave owner by trade. He is not conflicted about slavery. In his mind, his slaves are his property and they're not human. So whereas Jefferson and Washington kind of go back and forth and waffle on it, and both of them, by the way, emancipate their slaves upon their death. They put it as part of their will. Jackson's not going to. Jackson's not that guy. So obviously the mentality had changed too. Okay, whereas the founders really wrestled with this, their children did not. Okay, so obviously slavery had changed not just as an institution, but as a mindset as well. Oddly enough, during Jacksonian America, you also have the Second Great Awakening. So we're having a return towards biblical thought and theory. So that's certainly perplexing. And of course, you have the issues about expansionism. Manifest Destiny is going to rear its head during the 1830s and 40s, from Jackson all the way up through to and through Polk. You're going to have the War for Texas independence in the 1830s, 1835, 36. And then, of course, you're going to have the Mexican War in the mid to late 1840s. You're also going to have abolition occurred during that time period. This is a time of social reforms. So you have William Lloyd Garrison, you have Frederick Douglass, you have a number of abolitionist speakers during the 1830s and 40s. If you remember, even Lincoln during his Lyceum address in the 1830s, in 1837, is going to be talking about, hey, law and order is important, and he's defending the idea that, hey, an abolitionist should have a right to have a printing press, because under the law of the land, he should have the right to freedom of speech. So while Lincoln isn't necessarily an abolitionist, he's certainly not in favor of slavery at the time. Now, the other part that I wanted to make sure I looked up real quick are what could then pertain to this question. And I don't expect you to remember these dates, and we didn't spend a lot of time on these people. Slave rebellions. There were plenty of them. There were four that I want to mention, okay? 1739. So this is well before the time frame that we're talking about. This is during colonial times. 1739 is the Stono Rebellion down in South Carolina. Okay, so the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, which is a group of slaves that rise up against their masters and kill quite a few of them, by the way. The Stono Rebellion is what causes a massive squashing of slavery in South Carolina, or of slave, freedom, if you will. They kind of smash down on the slave communities in South Carolina after that, to the point where you don't really hear too much in the way of slave rebellion openly until much later. In 1800 in Virginia is Gabriel's Rebellion, but it actually never ever gets started. They're sold out by other conspirators who kind of get cold feet. This is referenced in one of the documents we're going to talk about. So Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia happens in 1800, but it actually doesn't happen. It is sold out, like I said beforehand, and all the people are rounded up, arrested, and many are hanged for their at least even entertaining the idea of having this. Denmark Vesey happens in 1822. 1822 in South Carolina, Denmark Vesey has a slave rebellion down in South Carolina. He eventually is caught and hanged as well, along with other co-conspirators. And in 1831, probably the most notorious and the one most well-known is Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia. Again, in 1831 in Virginia, Nat Turner really kind of scares the bejesus out of both the federal government and local governments in the South about slaves uprising. And this is where you first start getting this, these slaves were put up to it because of these northern reactionaries, these people like William Lloyd Garrison and the Liberator. But in weird ways, them screaming about these abolitionists of the North actually garner more support for abolition in the North, because they do violently put down Nat Turner's rebellion. So again, there are some historical events that pertain directly to this question, but giving you the background here, now we can continue to the documents. So, Document A, Lord Dunmore's Proclamation. This is where you get to participate. Anybody want to take a stab as to what Lord Dunmore's Proclamation is basically saying?
I think it's saying that slaves will be freed if they join the British Army.
Correct. And Baker gets a point. All right. So freedom, basically what they're doing is offering up freedom to anyone that sides with the British. All right. So it's basically saying, look, if we free you, we expect you to take up arms in defense of your mother country. All right. So it certainly is offering it up. And you always have to keep in mind, this happens in 1775. Is there any uprising in Virginia at this point?
I don't think so.
Not yet. That is correct. Remember, up until the signing of the Declaration of Independence, there has been no real attack outside of the Boston area. All right. Keep in mind, during the Second Continental Congress, all of the other 12 colonies keep on looking at Massachusetts going, why do you constantly have the problems? Okay. There's been no attack on Philadelphia. And up until the Declaration of Independence, there's no attack on even Boston, or I'm sorry, New York, I should say. So Virginia is not in the line of fire in 1775. So what is Dunmore really trying to do here?
Kind of get Virginia to side with it, since it seems the North are the ones where all the battle is taking place.
All right, seeing how many people answered the call, that's number one. But folks, if he's offering to give guns to former slaves, what is he really, in a sense, doing? Mr. Blackwell is correct. You have the opportunity for revenge. You can go kill your old master, especially if he's a patriot. Okay, if he's somebody that's against the British cause, you have the right to fight against him. Okay, now did a lot of slaves answer this call? No, not many. Not many did, and of course, this was certainly squashed by many slave owners as well. But it is putting forth the idea that the British are willing to kind of take people that are currently residing in these regions, and they did this in the Carolinas and Georgia as well. They offered this up to former slave or to slaves that, hey, we will free you if you then turn and fight for us. Now, the American army also did the same thing. Nathaniel Greene, when he goes down later in the war, and he starts the process of fighting Cornwallis down in South and North Carolina, he also offers freedom to many slaves for joining the cause and fighting for the Americans. Not a whole heck of a lot did answer the call, but there were some. So during the course of our fight for freedom, they are willing to kind of relax the ideals of slavery at that point. Okay. All right. Document B. Somebody other than Baker and Blackwell want to take a stab as to what in the world document B is talking about. Again, you can chat it or you can just unmute and take a whack at it. That put you all to sleep. Would it help if I brought it up here? Come on, folks, don't make me call you out on document B. We're barely through this. Osborne, Meese, or Sears, go ahead and take a whack at it. Let's go.
Someone just put something in the chat.
Thank you. Sears, thank you. Okay, Sears, you're on the right track here. The slaves have done a great deal to help them get their independence and have done a great deal to help themselves even to get their independence. What is he talking about here? He's talking about freed slaves that don't have rights. And why don't they have rights? They don't have the right to vote. Because at the early stages, it was wealthy white landowners that had the vote. He's saying we have freedom, but we don't have freedom of choice. We can't decide on our taxation. We can't decide on our rights. So this is a petition to ask for the right to vote. All right. So you are correct, Sears, in that the slaves do a great deal to help, but aren't given the rights. And in this case, not slaves, but freed slaves. These are freed individuals in the North that have, and for that matter, he could be talking about freed slaves in the South as well, who did just as much to help with the revolution, did just as much to help set up society, but just aren't given as the same rights as everybody else. Document C is a map. Osborne and Meese, what is this map trying to tell us about slavery in the United States between 1790 and 1830? Go ahead. You can even just say the obvious of what each map is telling us. So either unmute or chat it. Okay, Mies, you're correct. Where it is most popular, they are talking, or at least showing you here, the main component is 50% and over are these dark shaded regions here and dark shaded regions here. Now, what can we deduce about America in 1790 when we look at this? And you can look over here where all these areas here have under 10%, which are slaves, and the 50+% are on the coastal regions. To now here in 1830, you got this whole area that has high concentration of slaves and not as much up here. Okay. And of course, a lot of this area is without slaves. Okay. So what can we deduce out of this, Osborne or Mies? What can we deduce about those trends? Would it help if I mentioned crops? Which type of crops, Mies? Which ones are we talking about? If we're talking about southern crops, which one are we talking about? Okay, Osborne's correct, and Mies is correct. Good. Cotton. Was cotton big in 1790? The answer is no. It was big. It was king cotton by the 1830s. Anybody? Why? Not just trading it. What made it more profitable from 1790 to 1830? Why did they all of a sudden switch? Because in 1790, notice where the highest concentrations are, it's in Virginia and on the coastal regions of the Carolinas. Coastal regions of Carolinas in 1790 would have been rice. The Virginia region would have been tobacco. How in the world did we change? The cotton gin, Mr. Blackwell nails it with, of course, the question mark, cotton gin. But yes, you are correct. Cotton gin. In 1794, we invent the cotton gin. Eli Whitney puts it out there with the unintended purpose that slavery now pays. Slavery now pays because slaves can farm cotton and create more cotton than we've ever had before. They can make it cheaper. They can separate the seeds quicker. It becomes more of a industry at that point. So when we look at the map, the reason is because King Cotton through this region, the Cotton Belt, becomes the most important industry of the Southern economy. Okay. Whereas it was tobacco and rice back in 1790, by 1830, it's King Cotton. So this goes a long way to explaining why, yes, some slaves got their freedom, and most of the slaves that got their freedom were either northern slaves who, let's be honest, in 1790, the slaves that were in New York and Pennsylvania, they were house servants. Okay. By 1830, many of the people in New York and Pennsylvania had switched their tune when it came to slavery. And in many cases, some of these states had outlawed it. Okay. So some of these states had basically said, we're no longer in slavery. And quite honestly, when they disallowed it, they said, look, if you have one right now, you can have it till you die, but you can't pass them on through your will. Okay. So a lot of the slaves that were freed in the North were freed because, hey, their masters had died. Okay. So in many cases, this was just time sensitive more than anything else. The South did not have those same processes. So this is kind of a little known thing too. Once they outlawed it up here, how did they get more slaves in the South? Many of these slave owners, when they realized they were going to lose their slave, they sold their slaves to Southern planters. Okay. So it wasn't as simple as like, oh, Northerners all of a sudden grew a conscience and went, well, I'll free my slaves. Some of them saw an economic opportunity of selling them to the South. Okay, that's not to say all of them did. Some of them just said, well, you know what, this is an evil institution, and people like Franklin are correct. So they released their slaves. Okay, but this did not happen across the board. So to answer that question and to relate it, a lot you can glean out of these maps are, hey, the reason we had more freed slaves, states started to say, hey, we need to abolish this institution. So, of course, there's going to be a larger amount of freed people, but the freed people weren't really necessarily coming from the South. Okay. And so the South, with King Cotton, with the advent of King Cotton from the 1790s and the early 1800s, they're going to, before 1808, import a tremendous amount of slave labor from Africa, and for that matter, from the Latin American colonies as well. Okay. So, sure enough, we move on to document D. I'm going to go ahead and take document D because this one's darn near impossible. And this is one of those documents that, quite honestly, I'm not sure what the AP board was thinking with this one. Document D is labeled the Negro Methodist Meeting in Philadelphia in the 1790s. Okay. I don't expect you to understand or know what in the world they're talking about here. And I'm just checking to make sure. Okay. In 1790s, they were having these camp meetings. This is the precursor to the Second Great Awakening, and the key is Methodist. Okay, because remember, in the Second Great Awakening, the two major forces in the revival of religion were the Methodists and the Baptists. These African Americans are part of this Methodist meeting in Philadelphia, so they're in the north. Okay, what's the key? They're dressed like white people, and they're acting a little bit different in their services. So they're showing that the African Americans are having an impact upon not just the political and economic, but also the spiritual side of the American Republic. They're becoming part of the American Republic. They're dressing like Americans. They're attending church. They've got family structures. You're supposed to kind of pick out that they're being a little bit more, shall we say, dramatic in their worship, but at the same time, this is going to spill over into the American, kind of camp meeting mentality during the Second Great Awakening. There are going to be white people that act like this at their camp meetings as well. So there's kind of meshing of the two cultures. Again, I don't know what the AP board was thinking with this, that, high school students were supposed to glean that out of a picture like this. But that's really what they're trying to get across, is that the key word is assimilation, that they are assimilating into American culture by dressing like other Americans and by going to church, but that they were still kind of influencing the American culture with their own version of religion. Okay. However, you're supposed to bring that in. This would have been, quite honestly, if I had this question, I would have skipped this document in answering the question if I were in your shoes. Document E, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. Anybody want to kind of talk about what document E is all about?
It kind of sounds like they're having to prove that they're worthy of freedom, is what I kind of got from it when I was reading it. There's probably something else there too, but that's the major point.
Baker, nail on the head. Nail on the head. We must be industrious to earn our freedom. Okay. If we don't show that we are industrious, if we don't show that we can do heavy labor, if we don't show that we can get jobs done, then we're merely perpetuating the stereotype that we're lazy and that slavery is somehow good for us, that they're somehow teaching us how to be industrious. So Jones and Allen here are saying, be industrious, show that you don't need an institution to show that you are a hard worker and you are part of this society. So you are absolutely correct. There's no higher purpose here other than, hey, earn your keep so that no one can say, look, that person's lazy and should be a slave. Okay, so you are correct in that assessment. Document F, Venture Smith's narrative. Anybody want to take a stab at this one? Sears, you are correct. Slaves were allowed to purchase their freedom. Not all the time, but Venture Smith is saying, "Hey, look, I asked my master if I could purchase, and he said, yeah, I'm open to it. He's got to work for it." And this goes back to what we kind of talked about when we were, discussing this time frame. There were slaves that had side work. They would, do their chores, their specific jobs for their master, and then they would go and work on a different plantation to earn some cash, especially if they were good with, blacksmithing, or they were good with a specific machine or a specific farming tool or whatever the case may be. They would go and help out at harvest time, and they would collect their cash. They would collect their earnings, and over time, they would purchase their freedom. Now, this goes into the part of the question that's asking about why is there an elevation of freedom? Because there are some that are buying their freedom. Okay, so there is that possibility that you weren't just stuck in slavery. Now, were there slave owners that didn't allow that? Sure. But this one, Venture Smith's owner, did allow him the process of earning his freedom. Document G, the Confessions of Ben, a conspirator in Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, 1800. This is the document that's related to what I talked about earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and answer this one. What is this giving you? Gabriel and his followers are kind of putting it out. Hey, summer's almost over. It's not a good time for us to rise up during the winter time. And they kind of come to the realization that most of the soldiers in the region had put away their weapons. Okay. If you remember in 1800, there was a quasi-war with the French, where there was a feeling like, hey, we have to be ready. In all likelihood, there could be problems down in Spanish Florida. There could be problems from, invasion by the French. We have to be on our guard. We have to be ready for this. So there was kind of a general feeling like, oh man, we have to be on preparedness. Now they're saying, hey, these guys who were on preparedness are putting away their weapons. This is a good time for us to rise up. And, of course, he said, I read in my Bible where God says, if we will worship him, we should have peace in all of our land. 5 of you shall conquer 100, and 100,000 of our, and 100,000 of our, 1,000 of our enemies. Okay. So what he's basically saying is now's the time to rise up. Okay. So this is kind of saying the decision to rise up before they ever got a chance to, when they were sold out. This is somebody confessing, yep, we were going to rise up against our oppressors in this year. Okay. So again, why is there a rise for many freed people? There is a feeling like, hey, this is a region in South Carolina where over 50% of the population are slaves. This is not a safe situation to have if they're thinking about rising up against their masters. What you're also supposed to glean out of this is there are going to be violent uprisings by many of these slaves, because slavery is changing. Slavery is no longer, I'm taking care of my slaves. They're not my children anymore. They're just workers, and they're replaceable. All right. So this would also go into any argument that you had that, hey, slavery is becoming more of an institution rather than just some part of the economy. Okay. Document H, letter to ministers from the Vermont Colonization Society. I'm going to go ahead and take this one. If you remember colonization, this was this idea that we free slaves and then send them back to Africa. Okay. Lincoln was a part of this. He was part of a colonization society, the American Colonization Society. This was the idea during the antebellum that freed slaves could be sent back to Africa to settle in places like Liberia, which their capital city was named for James Monroe, because we basically carved out an area of Africa in the early 1800s specifically for freed slaves. So Liberia, Liberty, Liberia, and Monrovia was the capital city, was a plan that, hey, we free the slaves and we send them back. Okay, they don't want to live here. Many whites didn't want them to live here. They didn't feel like, hey, they could really assimilate into our culture. So let's send them back. So the Vermont Colonization Society, along with many of the colonization societies, are double-edged swords here. Yes, they want freedom of slaves, which you could on surface say, wow, great, they want abolition, which they did. They didn't want them living with them. This goes right in line, and this is where you could link up to another document. You could link up to the Wilmot Proviso, after the Mexican War, that all the land that we get from Mexico should be free because they want the slaves to go west. They don't want them to live in Pennsylvania. Well, Vermont Colonization Society, they're just as racist as anybody else. Yes, they want freedom, but they don't want them living here. Okay, we want them to be free and don't come here to Vermont, go back to Africa. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there where, yes, they want to free the slaves and they want to, be right with God, but they don't want the Africans to come live with them. Okay, so document H would be talking about, yes, we want their freedom, but not here. And then document I, Prince Hall, an African-American leader in Boston and founder of the African Masonic movement in 1797, and Hosea Easton, an African-American living in Boston in the 1820s. Both of them are talking about what?
They're free but not viewed as equal in the North.
Certainly not equal. So if you remember when we talked about this time frame, what is this giving rise to? If slavery is starting to go away, especially in the North, and in both these are Boston, if slavery is going away, and we talked about it by 1830 in Massachusetts, slavery is outlawed. Notice it's one of those areas where they have no slavery. What are they replacing the slavery with? Segregation, Mr. Blackwell, excellent. The root cause. So segregation isn't just a Southern institution. It's something they learned from their Northern counterparts. Okay, the racism replaces it. So just because you have abolition doesn't mean you have equality. Okay, so yes, there are freed men and women in the Boston area, but they are not being granted their equality within the society of the North. Okay, all right. So there's your DBQ. Those are the documents. Did pretty well today. Not bad. What I'm going to do is take off presentation mode here. All right. So remember, the question again, at its root, is asking two things. First of all, many Americans gained freedom from slavery, yet, same period, the institution of slavery expanded. And explain why both these changes took place. I'm sorry, the first part is explain why both those changes took place and analyze the way both free African Americans and enslaved African Americans responded to these challenges. All right, let's take the first part. Why are there more freed slaves? One part of that answer would be the North started to abolish it within their own states. States like Massachusetts said no more. Some states like New York and Pennsylvania had more of a gradual emancipation, and you could also talk about the Northwest Territory not allowing it at all. Okay, that's not to say that there weren't freed slaves in the South. You could talk yet again about Jefferson. You could talk about Washington. They were slave owners who emancipated their slaves in their wills. Okay, all of that would be fair game for why there were more freed slaves. The second part is, why did the institution grow? The key to it is cotton. The cotton gin made cotton profitable. It replaced the cash crops of tobacco for the most part, and it certainly replaced rice and indigo as the major exports of the Carolinas and Georgia. And that became the major product of plantation living. So these plantations became very wealthy institutions because of slavery. So the institution of slavery is going to grow because of the advent of King Cotton. All right. The second part, analyze the way both free African Americans and enslaved African Americans responded. You have in the documents petitions and observations of freed slaves. You have people that are petitioning saying, I want my rights. And you also have people who are saying, look, I'm walking around Boston and here's what we have to deal with. So you have that. You also have the slaves. You have confessions of somebody who says, look, this is the best time to revolt against our master. But you also have people saying, hey, look, there are ways for me to earn my freedom without having to kill my master. Okay. You can answer this in a multitude of ways. This is, again, across time frames. This is a time frame of basically from the American Revolution all the way up to and through the Jacksonian years that you have to talk about. The outside information that you can glean into this is they never tell you about a slave uprising. So if you can remember any of the slave uprisings, you can put that in there. You can talk about Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, and it's not mentioned anywhere here. Even though they give you the document about Gabriel, they never talk about the actual event, nor do they tell you where it really had an impact. Okay. You can bring in outside information from the Declaration of Independence. You can bring in outside information from the Constitution. You can bring it. They didn't give you any documents from politics. Okay. Even a petition. What are they petitioning? They're petitioning for the right to vote. Okay. So they never even give you that. So this is, I'm telling you, the amount of times people get a question like this and they go through the documents and they're like, I don't even know where I'm supposed to begin. This is actually an easier question because they are telling you, here are a bunch of documents that have nothing to do specifically and directly with the government documents you've been studying all year. They never give you any of the Bill of Rights. They never give you any of the Constitution, and they never give you the Declaration of Independence. They don't even give you the Northwest Ordinance. Imagine how many documents you could use and cite almost from memory, and that counts as your outside information to bolster your argument here. So is this question really a bad question? No. It throws you off when you get that stupid cartoon of the, Methodist Church. That one will throw you off. I'll grant you that one. But imagine how many of these documents you could pick up. I mean, Baker was right out of the door saying, hey, document A is about, hey, they're granting freedom if you join up the cause here. Okay. They're almost a gimme question at that point. You talk about how that is an impact, that there are people rising up to get their freedom. But at the same time, you could also say, hey, they weren't willing to sell out their country for their freedom. And you could also talk about how, hey, I'm not going to sell out my slave owner in 1775 because he's good to me. We are kind of like a family, and I'm not going to go rise up with the British if I can stay here and help him in his pursuit of independence, hoping that maybe, hey, over time, I get mine. That's certainly, look, if the British would have asked in 1830 in Virginia, hey, I'll give you your freedom if you rise up and fight for me, there's a good chance that they would have. Okay. And by the way, outside information you can glean as well. If you remember, one of the main problems in the Texas independence was the fact that the Texans were coming down and not only taking land from Mexico, but they were bringing their slaves with them. And one of the things Santa Anna used to say all the time is, hey, bring your slaves over. Slaves, why don't you come over and fight with the Mexicans? We'll grant you your freedom. The Spanish did that too in Florida. If you remember, Jackson had problems. If you remember back in the 18-teens, Jackson invades Florida. And everybody denounces him except for John Quincy Adams, who says, hey, this is actually probably a good thing. Well, one of the main reasons that Jackson did that is because the Spanish were encouraging slave insurrections in the South. So they wanted to get rid of that. So obviously the mentality had changed from the 1770s all the way up until the 1830s. That all can be part of your answer. Thesis statement needs to be a direct argument that answers that entire question. That's probably 99% of the battle right there, is coming up with a good argumentative thesis statement that answers the whole question. That's what I want you to work on tonight into tomorrow and try and turn in a pretty decent thesis. That's what I'm going to look at to see, are we getting better at framing an argument? Okay. If you're still struggling with that part, and many of you are, not just the people in the session, but anybody who's watching this after the fact, make sure you're asking that question. I have office hours tonight from 8 to 11. This is my late night office hour for those that can't wake up before noon. If you have questions, log in and we'll talk through how to formulate a thesis statement if you're still struggling. Remember, thesis statement is not a, 4 fragmented sentences adding up together. It has to be one statement of purpose that answers the whole question and can be proven. All right. Again, if you're struggling with that part, log into office hours, we'll talk. Okay. If you're struggling, and you can even send me an email, here's a thesis that I came up with. Can you kind of tell me, am I on the right track? And we'll work through it. We can bandy it back and forth. Or, of course, you can do what you've been doing. Just submit. You'll notice that the part I'm really looking at is your thesis. Most of you are doing fine with the documents. You're doing fine with the background. You're following along with what we're doing. The only thing I've been leaving blank is you've got to come up with a thesis. You'll notice I've been commenting on whether or not it's a strong thesis or just changing it entirely. Okay? You can continue with that if you don't feel like you need help at this point, or, maybe I'll tweak it here and there on the homework when you turn it in. It's completely up to you, whatever you want to do, okay? And, of course, you can hang back and ask questions from this point as well, okay? Whether through chat or you can just hang back and ask questions. I can stay on the line for a couple more minutes, no problem. Any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to stay. Otherwise, I'm going to let you go. Your 5th one will be posted tomorrow. I think the session will probably be on Monday. At 2 p.m. We'll just continue with what we typically are doing, roughly every 3 days. That'll give you the weekend to look over. And this one, I'm going to try and give you one on either women or another minority group, whether it be Native Americans or whether it be Japanese and Chinese Exclusion Act. There'll be something minority-based because, again, you're going to have to learn how to do this because I have a feeling, like I said in the previous one, I have a feeling your question on May 15th will probably be something like this, where it's over the course of years, okay? And they're probably going to give you some sort of thematic or conceptual question as opposed to one specific time frame. Again, I could be wrong, but I have a feeling that's what they're going to do. So again, your DBQ number 5, I'll try and put that out tomorrow. I'm weighing the options between a few, but it probably will have something to do with if I had to bet, I'm probably going to settle on the women's movement. Okay. And when I say women's movement, I mean suffragette movement of the late 1800s.
Did we go over document J? The David Walker?
I skipped it. Yeah, sorry.
Because I kind of got a little bit of it, but half of it flew over my head.
Well, it flew over my head so much I forgot to include it. All right, so David Walker, appeal to the colored citizens of the world, 1829. For my own part, I am glad Mr. Jefferson has advanced his positions for your sake, for you will either have to contradict or confirm him by your own actions, and not by what our friends have said or done for us. For those things are other men's labors and do not satisfy the Americans, who are waiting for us to prove to them ourselves that we are men, before they will be willing to admit the fact. For I pledge to you my sacred word of honor that Mr. Jefferson's remarks respecting us have sunk deep into the hearts of millions of the whites and never will be removed from this side of eternity. For how can they, when they are confirming him every day by our groveling submissions and treachery? Remember, Americans, that we must and shall be free and enlightened as you are. Will you wait until we shall, under God, obtain our liberty by the crushing arm of power? Will it not be dreadful for you? I speak, Americans, for your good. We must and shall be free, I say, in spite of you. You may do your best to keep us in wretchedness and misery, to enrich you and your children, but God will deliver us from you. And woe, woe will be to you if we obtain our freedom by fighting. Okay. Obviously, what is David Walker on the surface saying?
We're equal and we shouldn't have to prove it.
Okay, so obviously he's saying that. And of course, what is the veiled threat?
Do you really want to go to war over this?
Yeah, because it's not going to work out well for you. Okay. Basically saying we got nothing to lose.
They
You have
really,
everything to lose.
yeah.
Okay. And who's the Mr. Jefferson he's referring to? Don't overthink this one. Who's the Mr. Jefferson he's referring to?
Just Jefferson.
He's got a first name.
I'm sorry, I can't remember right now.
See, and I promised I wouldn't call anybody out. I'm sorry, Baker. It's Thomas.
Okay.
It's Thomas.
Yes, that's it.
Thomas Jefferson. And look, how important is Jefferson? He can just say Mr. Jefferson and his words, and you know he's talking about the Declaration of Independence. You promised all men are created equal. White people celebrate it. Here we are in bondage. You either free us or you got to answer to God. And if you don't free us soon, you're going to answer to God much quicker. It's a very veiled threat. We're going to rise up against you. Okay? It's an appeal. 2 years later, Nat Turner has a rebellion in Virginia, Jefferson's home state. Now, Jefferson's, of course, dead by that point. You know, he dies in 1826. But still, it's a pretty obvious. You can use that document to link it to Nat Turner. Sorry about skipping that one. I knew I forgot something. Just got so excited to move on. All right. So again, if you need help writing your thesis, I'll be on 8 to 11 tonight. You can certainly always write an email, and I'll answer it that way. Or like I said, you can just submit the document, and we can workshop it from there. But I do want to make sure that you write a good thesis statement for this one in the, you know, not only the thesis, but your supporting arguments. How are you going to support it? How are you going to break it down? And I've already had somebody submit this. They gave a supporting argument number 4 because they divided it up from free men to the enslaved in the perspectives on it. And they also divided it up on why there were more free men and why slavery was expanding. So again, you don't have to do it that way, but that's how they did it because they were like, look, if I were writing this, I'd write 6 paragraphs, 4 in the body, and then the intro and the concluding statements. So however you want to kind of divide up what you're doing, that's up to you. Okay. All right. If I didn't put you to sleep and you know, get you your nap time, go ahead and go take a nap. It's a good day to nap. One of those kind of ugly days outside where, you know, real good to take the time off. Otherwise, I will see you on Monday, hopefully, and or at office hours if you need it.